Hello and welcome. My name is Celine Coggins, and I'm the board chair of the Rennie Center for Education Research and Policy. I was also one of the Rennie Center's first staffers, and I'm currently the executive director of Grantmakers for Education. So excited to see this room filling up so quickly. We have a packed agenda, and it's my privilege to welcome you today. As someone who's been around education policy in Massachusetts for 25 years, I never thought I'd physically miss being in the Omni Parker house, but I really do. And as someone who's been so long in this work, I was especially grateful to get an advanced look at the condition of education this year. Rennie's been doing this tracking since 2013, so for almost a decade. And as we're all trying to make sense of what's happening in this moment, this is such an essential resource. The condition of education in the Commonwealth represents the Rennie Center's commitment to building an education system in Massachusetts that equitably and effectively serves all students, especially those who have been historically marginalized. There are three parts to the condition of education work. First is the data dashboard, which captures topics from early childhood through post-secondary education. I pored over this year. Having longitudinal data on and publicly tracking things like absenteeism and enrollment and advanced coursework is so needed right now. This year is going to be essential to our understanding of how to build a recovery that's going to work for kids. The second piece of the condition of education is the action guide, which looks ahead by profiling innovation happening around the Commonwealth. We all know that going back to school later in 2021 should not look like it did in 2019. So this piece helps us to say, how could it look different? This year's focus is on the integration of communities and schools. And then finally, the third piece of the condition of education is this public release, this public discussion that says, where do we go from here? All right, so I'm the person who gets to do a whole bunch of thank yous. I'm gonna start those now. First, I'd like to thank the folks who let us into their schools and had conversations about what's happening right now. And so that includes the Benjamin Banneker Charter Public School, Bunker Hill Community College, the Chelsea Public Schools, the Framingham Public Schools, the Met Regional Career and Technical Center, the National Parent Leadership Institute, the Learning Community Charter School, Somerville Public Schools, and Springfield Works. On this snowy day, I felt like I was reading out the cancellations, but these are the folks who really helped to make the report what it is. The COE also has an advisory team that makes sure that the research and findings align with evidence and best practice. We want to offer a special thanks to Julia Freeland Fisher, the Clayton Christensen Institute, and Dr. Karen Mapp at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who informed the findings. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff at the Rennie Center. So Chad, of course, will be speaking later, Sinead Chalmers, Sophie Zamar-Ripa, Naina Bala, and Laura DeJourney. With that, I'd like to turn things over to some very important respondents and panelists, starting with Jim Heiser. Jim is the Massachusetts Secretary of Education. He's been a leader in advancing high standards for Massachusetts schools since his time as state board chair in the late 1990s, and I'm really excited to hear from him. All right, Jim, take it away.
Good morning, and thank you, Celine. I really appreciate that. Also appreciate hearing you say you've been doing this work for 25 years, which means we got into it at just about the same time, as hard as that is to believe. That's a long time ago. And equally hard to believe, I also missed the Parker House. So this time next year, hopefully we'll all be there once again. I should probably also begin by apologizing in advance to you and to the Rennie Center team for screwing up the 2021 data dashboard. I'm afraid canceling MCAS last spring, along with all the shifting sands of schooling that's been going on this year, have created a lot of data gaps and messed up trend lines. But I'm sure the Rennie Center will figure out how to make sense of it all. But I'm sorry nonetheless. But more important, I want to thank everyone on this call, and especially everyone in the field who is working on behalf of children, students, and families for the incredible job you've all been doing during this pandemic. Back in March, 10 to 11 long months ago, Our normal ways of working and just about everything else were disrupted. And not just at the margins, but in almost every way. Educators, staff, students, and families have also showed their own personal self-reliance, initiative, and flexibility by adjusting their daily lives to the new normal while maintaining that focus on getting the job done. And importantly, often taking on new responsibilities in the wake of this unexpected crisis. I also want to give a big shout out to my colleagues in state government at EEC, DESE, and DHE in particular, and the commissioners here today and their entire teams who have helped us keep our promises to early education programs, schools, colleges, students, and families across the Commonwealth while addressing a sea of unforeseen and constantly changing challenges. Together with the often heroic efforts of educators and administrators in the field across the entire educational spectrum, they've helped students, families, and communities get through this terrible time while continuing to make progress, even in the face of the many obstacles posed by the pandemic. Let me just give you a few examples. Immediately after COVID forced the closure of early education programs, EEC and childcare providers from around the state stood up an entirely new system of 500 emergency drop-in childcare centers for frontline healthcare workers and first responders. And as we speak, EEC, in collaboration with several nonprofit and philanthropic organizations, is putting in place a pilot program to ensure early ed providers have real-time access to COVID testing in order to minimize staffing shortages due to sickness and quarantines. In order to help school communities close the digital divide and enable more effective remote teaching and learning, DESE provided almost $33 million in grants and in-kind purchases to over 250 school districts for 22,000 Chromebooks and thousands of Wi-Fi hotspots. And the department has also purchased over 11,000 portable classroom ventilation units for about 100 schools. And in higher ed, capacity building grants to Massachusetts-based labs, supported by partnerships with the state's Community Tracing Collaborative, have enabled colleges and universities, both public and private, to implement the country's most comprehensive and ambitious COVID testing and tracing program, which produced close to 3.4 million tests during the fall semester, with a positivity rate of less than 0.2%. None of this was in anybody's job description a year ago, but everyone has gone the extra mile to do whatever was necessary. The bottom line is that despite the many pitfalls, this has been a year of accomplishment, as we have all responded quickly and in most cases effectively to the challenges of COVID. So once again, thank you to all of you. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that everything has gone smoothly or that there haven't been significant gaps and setbacks, especially with regard to student learning and development, and particularly in those communities that have been providing mostly remote instruction through much, if not all, of the school year so far. As many of you have heard me say before, there's an ever-growing body of evidence and firsthand experience here in Massachusetts, across the country, and around the world that schools are safe spaces for children and adults when the standard health and safety protocols are followed. Even in communities with higher levels of COVID cases, there is little or no evidence of in-school transmission, with various studies indicating that infection rates for students who are in school are lower than for students who are learning from home. To address the direct and indirect costs of COVID and to enable the reopening of more schools, the federal government allocated almost $200 million directly to school districts as part of the CARES Act, and the governor earmarked another $200 million last summer. There is still $170 million of these funds that have not yet been drawn down, and another $734 million that is on the way as part of the most recent stimulus bill. At the same time, we are now rolling out a first-in-the-nation statewide weekly testing program for students and staff to offer even more support for in-school instruction. And the governor has designated individuals working in early education and schools as essential workers in order to prioritize them for the vaccine in the phase 2 of this distribution plan. But let me be clear, we do not believe that schools should wait for testing or vaccines to be fully deployed before bringing their students back into classrooms for in-person instruction. As you all know, this issue is not just about COVID. It's also about educational progress, mental health, social emotional development, and equity. Our children, especially those in traditionally underserved communities and other high-need students, are suffering the most, creating real learning and developmental losses and exacerbating achievement and opportunity gaps. For these reasons, we need to reopen our schools and classrooms for as many children as possible, as soon as possible. And now, so if you go to the next slide, all of this is a backdrop to the Baker-Polito education priorities as we begin 2021 and look ahead to the 21-22 school year. The first priority, of course, as I've already said, is getting more students safely back to school as soon as possible. Of equal importance is mobilizing federal, state, and local resources to provide students with extra help and extended learning time, beginning this school year, but extending through the summer and into next fall and beyond. This is not a one and done challenge. For many students, it will take years of focused effort to get them back on track. Third, we need to sustain the basic resources of our education system across all three sectors in order to provide stability and continuity of service through the pandemic, and to ensure that we have the infrastructure and capacity in place when we come out the other side. This includes, of course, full funding for the first year of the Student Opportunity Act, which I'll discuss in more detail later. Although there is much that we would all like to forget about this last year, there are also some important lessons to be learned about how to do education better, not just to get through a crisis or a disruption, but to improve access and outcomes on an ongoing basis. We need to identify those effective practices and embed them in the new normal. Some of this will undoubtedly involve the use of technology, but there are other promising developments, including the strengthening of partnerships between schools and their communities across a range of academic and non-academic supports. And finally, we need to maintain forward momentum around continuous improvement and equity, even as we deal with the challenges of the moment, by deepening our investment in those proven reforms and initiatives that will be essential to the long-term success of our students. So going on to the next slide. In the near term, this means implementing the new testing programs that I've previously mentioned at the early education and the K-12 levels. It also means putting in place plans and resources to expand summer learning opportunities, including acceleration academies like those Commissioner Riley implemented in Lawrence. Supporting schools in addressing the mental health and social emotional well-being of both students and staff, strengthening collaboration between school districts and community-based remote learning programs, now being operated by many licensed early education and after-school providers, providing targeted supports for high school students trying to earn their diplomas, and to those who are graduating this year but are not quite ready for college or the workplace. And finally, continuing to support childcare providers who are so essential to economic recovery, but many of whom are struggling to stay afloat given lower overall enrollment levels and COVID-related expenses and capacity constraints. So going on to the next one. In terms of FY22 spending priorities embodied in House 1 that was just introduced yesterday, and including the allocation of new federal dollars, this translates into the following. First, we are maintaining baseline funding across all three sectors relative to FY21, after taking into account some one-time appropriations for COVID-related costs, some increases that were being implemented mid-year due to the late enactment of this year's budget, and a variety of other earmarks which the governor has historically not included in his budget filings. This approach is consistent with the overall House 1 budget, which is growing at only 1% over FY21, excluding mass health, and including a $1.6 billion allocation in revenue from the stabilization fund. And of course, it's reflective of the uncertain economic situation we find ourselves in, which is not as dire as many had feared, I'm happy to say, but which still presents significant fiscal challenges to state and local finances. In K-12, as you've already heard, House 1 fully funds all of the required components of SOA, and more on that in a minute. Our fiscal plan also assumes implementing important changes to the way we fund early education, building off of our experience during the past year, including classroom-based grants, a new, more equitable parent fee schedule, and a transportation rate increase. EEC will also deploy its discretionary resources to support capacity building and workforce development in the field, including the continued reopening of programs to meet projected increases in parental demand for childcare, especially as the vaccine is deployed throughout the next several months. In higher education, we are planning a full year implementation of Mass Grant Plus for both community colleges and state universities to ensure that all students with an unmet financial need have access to the additional scholarship dollars to fully close the gap. And we'll be working with campuses to develop a core set of college success strategies and practices to help ensure that these additional aid dollars lead to increased graduation rates, especially for underrepresented student populations as part of the department's overall equity agenda. And finally, we will continue to expand our investment in growing early college and early career pathways with college and career planning and work-based learning experiences, including the Governor's Career Technical Initiative, which was announced last year to increase access to high-demand occupational credentials for both youth and adults. And then going on to the next slide. I now want to turn to the Student Opportunity Act and the projected flow of funds to our highest need communities. And as you can see by this graph, if you squint at least, House 1 would increase Chapter 70 by about $200 million in FY22. This reflects October enrollment numbers, it updates data on inflation and municipal revenue growth, and it applies the new SOA formula. Under SOA, the new formula is to be phased in over a 7-year period, so the updated rates reflect the first 1/7 installment, importantly including 1/7 of the rate increase for low-income students, using SOA's interim methodology for counting more economically disadvantaged students. SOA has also called for reimbursing transportation as part of the special education circuit breaker account and full reimbursement for eligible charter school tuition payments. Both of these expansions are included in the governor's budget based on the required SOA phase-in schedule. All told, direct state aid to schools and districts will grow by almost $250 million. Taking into account the new and expanded federal allocations to school districts, overall revenue will grow by almost $550 million next year, which is about the same as this year's growth. And then going on to the final slide. And since the new federal money is allocated using the Title I formula, which is similar to Chapter 70 in terms of its focus on low-income students, the combined impact is significant for the communities with the highest need children who have also been hardest hit by COVID. So the progressivity of the Student Opportunity Act is compounded and reinforced with the progressivity of the federal funds that are being distributed even as we speak. So that was a mouthful. And so let me end where I began by once again thanking all of you for the incredible work you have done and continue to do on behalf of our children, with a special thanks to Chad and his team at the Rennie Center for continuing to put data and research to work on behalf of changing practice and improving outcomes for children. And with that, thank you so much. And now I'd like to turn things back over to Chad, Rennie's fearless leader. There you go, Chad.
Thank you, Secretary Heiser. As always, we appreciate and value your willingness to join the conversation and engage with us on the issues and challenges confronting education. My thanks to Celine Coggins as well, the Rennie Center's board chair, for her insightful words in kicking off today's event. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chad D'Entremont. I'm the executive director of the Rennie Center. It is now my privilege to share with you findings from this year's COE Action Guide, and I hope express actionable and concrete strategies that can build on the Secretary's remark and examine how communities are responding in this moment in real time at the local level. This year, we aim to uplift key practices at the intersection of school and community. As recent events have made clear, we cannot improve student opportunities and outcomes without confronting the deep inequities built into our education system. And we cannot identify and push forward effective strategies for addressing these inequities without creating space for the diverse experiences and perspectives of those most impacted by reform efforts: students, families, educators, and communities. Before beginning, I do want to make clear that building a more integrated community-based approach must include a strong commitment to academic learning. The strategies in this year's report should not be understood as alternatives to skilled teachers, quality instructional materials, effective school leadership, or clear and high standards. Rather, community-based supports are complements to existing academic initiatives and should be used to reinforce the work that schools are doing while expanding the range of opportunities, resources, services, and perspectives available to students and their families. To build a more inclusive, community-based approach to education, we focus on 3 priorities: holistic learning, shared leadership, and multiple pathways to careers. The events of the past year have been painful reminders of the increasingly critical role education plays in addressing a number of issues beyond academic learning, such as food security, mental health counseling, technology access, and wraparound services for students and families. This is in response to the rising challenges families face and the importance of creating safe and stable environments for learning to occur, as Secretary Heiser expressed. For example, we see here that the number of homeless students in Massachusetts has increased by 3,700 students since 2016, data that doesn't account for the impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic. Holistic learning is a deliberate effort to acknowledge the expanded role of education and take an assets-based approach to unlocking students' strengths, interests, and passions while addressing their needs through increased connections to families and community providers. So how do we build these connections? It starts by uplifting communities' cultural wealth and tapping into the array of cultural knowledge, skills, abilities, and relationships possessed within communities, especially among marginalized groups that often go unrecognized and unacknowledged in white-dominated institutions. It also clearly means connecting learning experiences inside and outside of school. Learning can happen anytime and anywhere, and effective out-of-school learning can help students link core academics to real-world experiences and their own cultural backgrounds. Finally, taking a more comprehensive and community-based approach to learning supports the whole child by identifying and addressing barriers that could keep them from achieving their potential. Research suggests that a commitment to holistic learning that draws from students' cultural knowledge contributes favorably to reading comprehension and mathematical thinking and helps improve attendance rates. An example here is Framingham Public Schools' Office of Community Resource Development, or the CRD. Its mission is to expand access to high-quality out-of-school programming through effective community partnerships, offering connections to a range of programs serving all ages, from infants to high school students to adult learners. The CRD has created a one-stop shop for coordinating and connecting students and families to their communities. It hosts monthly cohort meetings with partners to review district and student level data across multiple domains, then collectively problem solve how to address pressing needs and take action. The second priority area in this year's action guide is shared leadership. How closely students, families, and communities feel connected, engaged, and respected by their schools goes a long way toward effective collaboration. As this slide makes clear, a strong majority of students do feel their families are respected by their schools. However, far too many, around 15%, question this relationship, and the numbers are higher among Black and Latinx students. Shared leadership addresses this challenge and goes a step further beyond collaboration by establishing equitable structures that bring new voices and perspectives into decision-making processes. These structures can be used to elevate student voice through focus groups and surveys, student-led conferences, or reserving spots for students with full voting privileges on school boards and committees. Researchers have found that such opportunities for student voice lead education policies and practices that better serve student needs. Schools can also create formal structures and partnerships to engage families and community members in the co-design of initiatives, programming, and supports. One example is Harvard Education Redesign Lab's efforts to create children's cabinets in communities across Massachusetts and beyond. Children's cabinets bring together local municipal departments and agencies working with children and youth, along with community members like business, union, and civic leaders, parents, and youth to develop a collective vision and system of supports for students' growth and development. Chelsea Public Schools has taken such an approach to shared leadership. Along with establishing a children's cabinet, the district has launched the co-design pilot to include families in every step of the district's plan to improve learning outcomes. Chelsea is predominantly a Latinx immigrant community with a majority white teaching staff. One goal of the co-design pilot is to shift racialized power dynamics within the community. There are 9 co-design teams working on issues ranging from improving discipline practices through the incorporation of restorative justice, to improving remote learning processes for English language learners, to improving school site councils at the elementary level. Our third and final priority is multiple pathways to careers. As this slide shows, using the proxy of access to advanced coursework, far too many students are not engaged in learning activities that lead to college and career preparedness and success. We see here that while about 2/3 of students access advanced coursework, less than 50% of low-income and high-need students, English language learners, and students with disabilities have the same opportunities. By working together, communities and schools can help lay a strong foundation for students' successful entry into adulthood by supporting academic preparedness that taps into students' individual strengths and interests, includes the exploration of career options, increases excitement for and engagement in learning, and establishes networks that provide necessary social capital to access future opportunities. Key strategies here, like with holistic learning, include tapping into community cultural wealth and assets, which may include mentoring, job shadowing and training, apprenticeships, and internships. Another strategy is 2-generation approaches to child and family development. 2-generation approaches create a caring and supportive environment for young people, while providing resources that help adults gain parenting skills and train for a career. For example, early childhood programs can also offer services that help parents pursue education goals. Alternatively, institutions of higher education can provide 2-generation support through childcare, family-based housing, and paid internships that provide families with greater socioeconomic stability. Finally, community partnerships are essential to providing hands-on learning that connects academics to real-world experiences, helping students increase their self-understanding and self-efficacy, necessary skills to enter the workforce. In this year's action guide, we feature Springfield Works as an example of a community-wide initiative that supports parents and caregivers in accessing employment while working to ensure their children are in safe and healthy environments. While the program is still fairly new, 88% of the 2019 cohort are on career pathways of their choosing. At the heart of this year's action guide and its focus on the priorities of holistic learning, shared leadership, and multiple pathways to career is a focus on school and community connections that take lessons learned from the past year and the difficulties we faced, but apply them to evergreen strategies that can last far beyond our response to this current crisis. If students are facing challenges to their emotional, mental, and physical well-being, they will struggle to engage in classes and develop new skills. If they have limited access to opportunities for cultivating their interests and talents, they won't be able to use those abilities to further their academic and career success. It is only by working together that schools and communities can fully address these challenges. Of course, I don't entirely expect you to take my word for it. As always, at the Rennie Center, our hope is to identify and share examples of these strategies happening on the ground. One place where that is occurring is Somerville Public Schools, which has taken a comprehensive strategy for engaging its community across our 3 priority areas. It is now my privilege to introduce Dr. Jessica Boston Davis, Director of Equity and Excellence at Somerville Public Schools, to share with us greater insight on what's happening there, what's possible in all of our communities, and introduce a panel conversation with other community leaders that we had earlier in the week. Jessica, please join us.
Thank you, Chad, and good morning, everyone. So I have the pleasure of introducing the community panel. And a key principle that guides my work in Somerville is the idea of collective responsibility in action, meaning how are we as a district and community working together to create solutions to complex issues? Much of that work is featured in the report around what Somerville Public Schools is doing. And this is especially important in the time like this during the COVID-19 pandemic. But beyond the pandemic, when things finally go back to normal, how can we learn from this collective action is the question. So what if, when this is all said and done, what if we didn't go back to business as usual and actually return to places even better than the ones we left, with a focus on the themes of holistic learning and shared leadership, and a real partnership between schools and the community? So in the panel, you'll hear what this looks like in action. There will be specific points on what it means to build an authentic foundation of trust, partnership, collaboration, and engagement, and building systems that will have an impact beyond the times of COVID. And so with that, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleagues, Dr. Almia Beta, Superintendent of Chelsea Public Schools, Ann Candelas, Director of Springfield Works, Tiffany Lilly, Director of Community Resource Development for the Framingham Public Schools, and Dr. Pam Ettinger, President of Bunker Hill Community College, who will moderate this conversation. I hope you enjoy.
If you could imagine that there are a number of other districts watching this saying, I want to do that. So the question is, what advice would you give to community or school leaders who's looking to emulate your model? If someone, Elmi, wants to do co-design, what are the pieces of advice that you would give them?
I would say you really have to lay the foundation first. Being a new superintendent a year ago, I was part of my entry plan. What I heard in areas that we need to improve on was engaging families and community in more authentic ways. So that kind of led me to say, oh, okay, so this will a pillar will be family and community engagement as I start a new superintendency. And so just building upon that, the community, the teachers, I think they were so hungry to engage families. We just hadn't made the efforts because you're just so busy with everything else. But then COVID presented this, the silver lining, and you can't let the crisis go to waste. And then we're thinking we're in remote learning, and I don't know how long we're going to be here when we have to engage our families somehow. We have to, they're not coming to the schools, and we've got to engage our students, and we've got to make sure our attendance rates are good. So how do we, over the summer, how do we do this? We got to figure something out. So a little bit of a backdrop in the journey is we first started off with, okay, we're going to have parent-teacher conferences up front. But I'm like, we don't want to call those parent-teacher conferences. So instead, we call them trust visits. And it's the trust visits happened on the sidewalks. We bought big tents and we put them outside so teachers could meet with families before school and have a physical connection. Everyone was masked and socially distanced. And then here's your little basket of books, supplies, art supplies, you name it, here, take it, the parents, here's your Chromebook, do you have a hotspot? So we made that connection. So we started off doing professional development in our 10-day negotiation when school started. It was built into our memorandum of understanding that we would do some family and community engagement. We built it in and started there too. And so that was a precursor. And then we had professional development where our wonderful Harvard intern did professional development on family and community engagement with our entire staff at every school. And so we set the foundation, and there was just this eagerness and this thirst. And so then we started to co-design. And so that's what I would say. It happened, it evolved. And that's what I love about this work, because it evolved. And there's so much ownership across the district with the people with the educators who are doing this with our families, that it's such a beautiful partnership. And I have to say, if there's one silver lining in all of COVID, it's the family and community engagement that we've been able to do during this time.
They can come. You know what I love is that, the trusted relationship really can start at the school, but not everything has to happen in the school. And so, as I look at some of the data, and you all know this, parents who complete a college degree double their incomes, right? A parent's level of educational attainment is also a strong predictor of a child's success. So when we look at what's missing. And again, I'm listening to, I love hearing your perspectives right from the school, is, the missing coordination of long-term engagement. So the transactional engagement is where we've been. And and when we talk about the many programs and services, we have 43 organizations doing workforce development, but only some of them do it really well. So we're engaging those organizations so that we can provide those programs and services together. So over the last year, and we've really learned a lot over various pilots, we've really got two new systems that really were organic in our community, which is, how do we collaborate to engage families and help sort of get the ready, willing, and able, so that more parents can become ready for work, training and work. But the second was, also, making sure that we're integrating that two-generation approach to career pathways model. So you're clearing those obstacles for workplace success, career advancement, and economic mobility. And that really is, we meet every week or every other week and go through, what are the barriers? What do we need to do together? And so the pressure is off any one organization to provide all of the interventions. And so when people kill me sometimes, but I say, I kind of see we have a lot of money in the system in certain ways. And this, our collaboration, our collective impact model has allowed us to see where the holes really are. And they definitely are at the very beginning, how we recruit parents. Like I talked about before, just they may not be ready, willing, and able to work. But trusted advisors, two-gen models, and a lengthier engagement provides, where now we can answer the question, is anyone better off after doing what they did?
I would echo a lot of the sentiments. I agree absolutely with Elmi and her approach. I think that, especially as a school department, one of the institutional pieces that we don't talk about enough is the unions. And you mentioned the MOU and discussing the importance of including those things in the MOU. And I also, as part of my role, co-chair all the professional development for the district. So I sat in on all the negotiations for professional development, and we had to say family and community engagement must be a part of professional development and our culture building throughout the year. And yeah, and designing those 10 gifted days from DESE, that was the key in our professional development, is that if we're telling our educators that we need to see the whole student, we also need to see our whole educator. And so those professional development is reflected, absolutely the family and community engagement work, the anti-racism work we needed to do, the emotional well-being work. And I think that that's really, I think, my biggest takeaway is like, we need to walk the walk. And I think that what we're asking our educators and our teachers to do for our students and their parents and their families, we as administrators and, systems people need to also do that for our educators. And it's hard, right? It's not easy to always figure all those pieces out. But I think as a district, that's where we're striving, because this is, to Anne's point, systems change. And we are trying to shift systems that have operated in a very confined and restricted way for many years. And that, requires an intense amount of humility, but also a large part of just open-mindedness and saying, hey, maybe we didn't get that right, right? And so one of the things that we changed in our professional development this year is fully rolling out an EdCamp model. So, education for our educators by our educators. And it's not perfect and clean cut and all of these things, but it's by design, because we need to hear. We even have a workshop on Tuesday, which is our professional development day, from students to talk about what they're facing right now, and our teachers can attend. And I think
Wonderful. Thank you again to our entire community panel, and a reminder to all that that entire discussion is available on the Rennie Center's website, renniecenter.org. It is now my privilege to briefly introduce our moderator and panelists. I believe everyone on this webinar would much rather hear from them than about them. But please allow me to say that all 3 education commissioners have participated in previous COE events. They give their time, effort of both themselves and their teams to the work that the Rennie Center does. Their willingness to engage in these kind of conversations and frankly address the challenges we all grapple with is a key part of improving our educational system, and we thank them for it. Our panel today will be moderated by Megan Irons, education reporter for the Boston Globe, whose work we have been closely following and admire. And our panelists include Samantha Agner-Treywergy, Commissioner, Massachusetts Department of Early Education and Care; Jeffrey C. Riley, Commissioner, Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education; and Dr. Carlos Santiago, Commissioner for the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. A friendly reminder to all of our panelists and moderator to please turn on their video screens and unmute. And Megan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. As you said, I'm a reporter at the Boston Globe, and I'm on the Great Divide team, which covers race, class, and opportunities in our schools. Delighted to be here today to lead a conversation around how schools, families, and the communities can continue to foster success for all our students in Massachusetts. So many thanks to you and the Rennie Center for making this happen. And welcome, commissioners. How are you doing? Okay, Commissioner Agner-Treywergy, this year's report details the importance of building trust and relationships with families. We know that parents and caregivers are children's first teachers. What strategies can early education providers use to develop these vital relationships from the get-go, to set a precedent for families and build their confidence to engage in their child's learning environment?
Absolutely. And thank you, Megan. Thank you to the Rennie Center for having us here today and for the opportunity to discuss these really critical issues. And I think that COVID has driven home the need for us to not only talk about what children are getting in terms of learning, but also thinking about those comprehensive needs that are evolving so quickly during these times as communities change and rapidly respond to the health crisis. I wanted to, before answering and digging into the question, give you a little bit of context of where EEC has been. Thank you to Secretary Heiser for highlighting some of the work we have been doing through the COVID crisis. But right before, I started in August of 2019, so the last Rennie event was my one of my final ones in person before we went into the crisis. But it has taught me, my tenure here has been so dominated by COVID that it has taught me so much about the ways we need to change and pivot and evolve the EEC context to respond to the way that the communities will recover. We passed a strategic plan the week the Commonwealth went into a state of emergency, but it continues to hold the pillars and I think resonate with the lessons pointed out by Rennie in this report. Really focusing on in order to really address the learning needs of children, we have to not only look at families, but look at the way children learn and mirror that in the way that we support our communities to come together. The work highlights that what we know about how children learn through relationships, through those kind of engaging activities in which a teacher and an adult, a parent, engage with their children to scaffold their education, particularly in the early years where you can't just go read a book and come to discuss it. Children really need to have modeling of how to read and how to engage. This applies to the way we work with communities too. And so to get to the answer to your question around how we actually think about meeting families where they're at and engaging families to be their children's first and most important teacher, I think that is highlighted in the relationships we need to build across sectors at the community level. And if we think about the holistic learning highlighted in this report, it really depends on a workforce across sectors that are aligned, that are communicating, that have structures to come together. That shared leadership pillar really requires us to understand the comprehensive needs of families and really figure out how we are filling in those gaps. So it's not up to a family to try to navigate multiple different systems. I often said as we were headed into last summer that we had to really focus on how we created consistent requirements for COVID, because a family is going to have so much trouble navigating the one requirement for their 7-year-old and another for their 3-year-old. And how do you get out of the house in the morning when you're trying to remember the rules of the system, as opposed to make sure your children are prepared to be safe and cared for.
Okay. Commissioner Riley, COVID-19 has immensely impacted the education system as we know it, and it has laid bare the vast inequities that exist between communities, families, and learners. Looking to the future, how can schools and communities work together to learn from the pandemic and provide essential services to students and families long after we've put away all our masks?
Thank you for the question. I think, what we've seen is there are definite stark disparities in different communities of how the virus has impacted them. We know, for example, that urban areas in particular have been disproportionately affected by this virus. And we see that with many of our urban districts being fully remote. And so about 80% of the districts in the state are learning in person, either hybrid or in person. 20% of those districts are fully remote. And many of those districts are urban districts. And so what we need to do is kind of assess what has taken place across the Commonwealth. Our assumption is that students who are in fully remote learning may have more ground to make up, but we need to assess that to see if that's true. The good news is we have federal dollars coming in that will allow us at the state to target resources to those communities that need the most help. And we know there's going to be academic loss. And so we can create programs and put money towards fixing some of the academic gains. But I would also argue there's a lot of social emotional work that needs to be done with our students, many of whom have been isolated now for almost a full year. And we see the tremendous amount of research out there that shows hospitalizations for mental health are up significantly across the country and in this state, suicidal ideation, depression, eating disorders. So we need to take a holistic approach to this, target our resources to where they're needed for both social emotional learning and the academic learning. Now, if there's a silver lining in any of this, and it goes back to what Dr. Albeta said earlier, Dr. Elmy and I used to work together in Boston, it's that districts have never been more engaged with families because of this crisis. And it's key that we don't lose that connection. We need to be able to build on that connection going forward, because parents have always been the sleeping giant in education. We've woken them up. If we can keep them engaged, we can dramatically improve outcomes for our kids moving forward.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Santiago, you've been spearheading action to achieve racial justice in Massachusetts education, part of which requires a close look at access and student experience. Through the lens of this work, how do you think institutions of higher education can provide opportunities for students to build on their social and cultural capital to enter the workforce as leaders and innovators?
Thank you, Megan, for the question. And let me thank the organizers and my colleagues in education, both on the panel and in the audience, for the important work that they do. These are very sobering times, and many of us feel like we have been in stasis for a long time. The loss of multiple human connections has been debilitating on faculty, staff, and students, as well as staff of the Department of Higher Education. And as the other panelists have mentioned, mental health consultations have increased, particularly at our public institutions. Homelessness and food insecurity among college students is now a major concern. Despite this, I see this as an opportunity and a moment in time to accelerate anti-racist work in Massachusetts. COVID-19 has accelerated and highlighted our focus on equity as it has disproportionately impacted communities of color. It has done so suddenly and with deadly consequences. In September of last year, the Lumina Foundation designated Massachusetts as a talent, innovation, and equity state, a tie state. We are the 5th state to receive this designation, but given our Massachusetts' long, convoluted, and difficult history with issues of race, this, I believe, is an important designation. However, it is a designation of promise rather than accomplishment at this time. It's important because it brings additional resources to our institution, but I think more importantly, signals the importance of equity to our overarching state goals. We are different from the 4 other equity states in that we are approaching this as a system of institutions as opposed to simply individual institutions. So what does this mean? Well, first, it means that we need to reconceptualize our institutions. We need to move from institutions that focus on college-ready students to institutions that focus on being student-ready. We need to train. We need to be trained in anti-racist approaches. And this includes the Department of Higher Education has already gone through the training, and I believe my other colleague agencies are doing the same. But it has to occur at the institutional level, the highest levels all the way through our higher education institutions. We are looking at auditing all of our policies from admissions to graduation to see if they are or are not equitable. We are reimagining the undergraduate experience through a series of task forces, work that has not been done since 1988. We are focusing on students as assets and the wonderful things they bring to our institutions. We are reinforcing the Rennie Center report that our institutions, our public institutions, are anchors in their communities. It's not just about increasing equitable access, however, it is more importantly about student success. So we know that enrollments will be declining, and we will continue to work and expend all our energy in this particular area.
This next question gets at what you're talking about, as well as what Commissioner Riley was saying, which is we've often patted ourselves on the back in Massachusetts about our exceptional education system. And as all 3 of you pointed out, COVID-19 has made that even more apparent, right? Families of color in urban communities say they can't fully access public school or higher education, while in the suburbs, wealthier, whiter families are setting up their own learning pods and using their vast resources to get their kids further ahead. So I'm wondering what the future looks like and what you guys think in terms of how can we close this gap and what can we do about it? Anybody can jump in at this point. Mr. Riley, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think we've known for a long time that things aren't fair in education, even in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, as you say, prides itself on being #1 on various test score metrics, although I would argue we've been losing ground for the last decade or so. But if you look closely at the test score data, we're really only #1 for some, and that kids living in low income areas, kids with special needs, second language learners, aren't experiencing the same success that everyone else is. And we need to do something about that. Part of that is being fixed. We're pleased that the governor announced that he will be proposing to fund the Student Opportunity Act to kind of level that playing field so that more resources are being targeted to those districts that need more support. And we're really profoundly grateful for that. But some of the work has to happen internally. One of the things we've been doing at the state is really trying to diversify our teacher corps. We know right now 40% of our students in Massachusetts are students of color. Only 8% of our teachers are.
Wow.
And as a superintendent in Lawrence, one of the things that we really felt moved the needle for us is we were able to triple the number of Latino teachers in a 5-year period. And the data has been pretty clear that a child of color that sees just one teacher that looks like them during their elementary years is more likely to graduate from high school and have better life outcomes post-college. And so we just need to be more reflective and intentional about what we're doing.
Commissioner Agnew-Tree, you're dealing with the early education aspect of this. What's your take on it?
Absolutely. And I think I can agree with my colleagues more in that this needs to be an intentional and institutional effort to be able to catch Massachusetts up in some ways. To Commissioner Riley's point, some strategies that have been able to address this and learn from other contexts as well. And I think that one of the things that early education and care needs to continue to be elevated. Massachusetts was the first state in the country to create a department like the Department of Early Education and Care, specifically to leverage those first early years and grades to ensure that we weren't falling behind, that children weren't falling behind. I mean, the academic achievement gap between children, affluent children and their lower income peers, particularly those of color, are evident by 18 months. And so if we don't start making sure that the access gap is addressed to high quality services that meet families' needs in the earliest years and grades, and look at lessons like the Readiness Center report points out of engaging families and addressing their needs, then we are paying catch up from the first time we start testing children in 3rd grade. And I think that is vital. And I will highlight as a final point on that, that partnering across our workforces is the other really essential part that I think we all recognize the need for, because in early education and care, many of our workforce are making minimum wage for doing, as I pointed out, some really impactful collaboration on behalf of children and families. And we represent the most diverse workforce in education. Over 40% of our workforce are women of color. To have that percentage of that demographic in our workforce and not be able to compensate appropriately to be able to do this vital work, I think is a challenge we're going to have to overcome to really address the equity gap in student achievement as well.
And Commissioner Santiago?
Well, I would state that if you understand Massachusetts history, and you can go back hundreds of years, it's easy, relatively easy to make a case for social justice. What we are saying is that the future of Massachusetts economy depends on our getting students, largely students of color, that are the growing segments of our population, into our institutions at increasing rates and successfully through. So we are also focusing on the economic imperative for this work. And it does, and it will take a reassessment of what our institutions do and how they do it to a level of detail that will determine, and I suspect many of us that have worked in higher education for quite a while know that many of the policies that we have, including many we have right now, are not equitable. They are not giving all students the same chance to succeed, and we have to confront that reality, and we have to change it. So I'm delighted that I have 2 partner commissioners who from their segments, we take the students from K through 12 that come from early educators, and it has to start. I always say this, it has to start at the earliest age. That's where the changes really have to work, and to have 3 agencies that can work together on this, I think is rather remarkable.
Okay, we have come to the point in our discussion where I'm going to be asking you questions that we've screened from the audience. And the first question, and I'll just open this up to the panel, is How will your agency support graduating high school students transition to college within this ongoing pandemic? And what lessons can we learn from the high school to college transition in 2020 that will inform that support? I guess Commissioner Santiago, this would be in your arena, right?
Sure. And I am smiling at Commissioner Riley because we have both worked and our boards have worked very hard at early college programs and dual enrollment programs. And we know the evidence is pretty clear that students in high school that have some kind of college experience and interaction, whether it's a course or a bridge program in the summer, the likelihood that they will go on to college increases dramatically. And so we're very supportive of those efforts. The administration has funded much of this work. The legislature has been supportive as well. So I think we know it works and we just need to bring it to scale.
Do you want to add to that, Commissioner?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an honor to work with Commissioner Santiago on this. We've really ramped up our early college programming in the last few years, and we're going to continue to do so. We know, as the commissioner said, that having kids get kind of inoculated, for lack of a better phrase, to college early during their high school years allows them to feel more comfortable, have some success, understand how to make a meeting with a professor, how to know where the cafeteria is, and that they're more likely then to succeed and persist through college to graduation. And so we know the research is very clear about this. And so the commissioner and I have been working long hours trying to continue to build up the number of kids who have access to this program. I would also say one other thing just related to particular high school seniors this year. We have modified our competency determination, which means they can find an alternative way instead of the MCAS to graduate. And there's a small number of students who have not yet passed the MCAS, and we're going to give them additional supports, probably an early college type course or community college course over the summer that can help springboard them into those early colleges. And that's something that the commissioner and I have been working on as well and hope to have an announcement on in the next week or two.
Well, let us know at the Globe, we'll cover it. This year's report documents efforts from across the education pipeline to purposely intertwine community and schools, whether through family engagement, coordination of out-of-school time programming, building pipelines for teachers of color, creating a diverse pathways to the workforce. Oftentimes, these are unique to a specific community or district. What do you see as the barriers to scaling these efforts across the state? And alternatively, do we even want to scale these efforts? Or do we want to set up communities to create contextual supports? And if so, how do we encourage this? Commissioner Ankner-Triewerge, do you want to tackle this question?
Sure. I think that this is the challenge that lies ahead of us. And I think the question of do we want to scale it, I want to go back to what Commissioner Riley had said, is that communities are very individualized, and we need to foster the kind of individual strategies that they have found. And I think this report highlights the ways that local leadership can help drive towards the outcomes we are all looking for by designing the kind of real on the ground collaborations across sectors, across providers, but also in collaboration with families to make sure that we are responsive in our strategies and not trying to find a cookie cutter one size fits all. And I think that that's what this time has really, really taught us. We have watched communities, and I think at EEC and my fellow commissioners, we've watched communities try to take what we give and develop and make so much more out of it on behalf of children, and we need to learn from them and try to hone in on the systems and structures we can develop at the state level to foster that kind of real individualized collaboration that will drive child outcomes.
Anyone else wants to jump in before the next question? Okay. What can we do as a state? This is a question from the audience. What can we do as a state to assess student learning and diagnose gaps in readiness for the next level? In particular, how does MCAS play into this for students above grade 3? And for younger students, how are we examining issues around kindergarten readiness and the development of early literacy skills?
So as far as MCAS goes, we have taken steps to change what MCAS can look like this spring. Particularly, we have reduced the amount of sessions that elementary school students in grades 3 to 8 need to take. At this time, there's been no word from the federal government or the state that the laws are being undone or there's any more flexibility than that. I would also say, however, that I strongly believe we need to do assessment on our children to know where the gaps are. At the beginning of this presentation, I said we have dollars that we need to target appropriately. And to do so, we need to know where our students are. And I think parents are going to demand to know what loss has taken place during this pandemic.
Yes, I think that is, all of those points are vital. I think in the early years, that assessment is a huge challenge that the country's grappled with for many years around how do you assess. And I think that there are some key lessons around child development and how we look at the context children are in as providing that readiness. It is very clear that third grade reading scores aren't driven by second grade letter recognition. It is driven by the number of words a child hears in the first 3 years of life, by the scaffolded academic language they are surrounded with as they enter preschool and are starting to get exposure to early literacy strategies that teachers employ. And so we need to look at not only to Commissioner Riley's point about how we use assessment to ensure we are designing learning environments that respond to where children are now, but also recognize that context that they are in will have to be responsive, and that it's not just the literacy skills that children who are going to be entering kindergarten ready to be on academic path of success need, and highlighting this report, that need to be ready to learn social emotionally. A child who cannot engage with their peers is not going to do very well in a group activity. And I think right now what we know is a lot of those skills, we need to focus on what context children have been in over the last year, what kinds of strategies different adults have used, so that we can make sure that we are accurately, to Commissioner Riley's point, assessing where and how we meet children where they are, help them overcome this trauma, and be ready to really learn in collaboration with all the adults who are there to foster their success.
Mm-hmm. I just want to check in with Chad now. We really want to hear from the audience. Are there any questions that have come up?
Oh, there's quite a few questions, and we've told the audience that we unfortunately won't be able to get to all of them, but we are collecting them and we will follow up, which I'm sure our commissioners are delighted to hear, and get answers to the questions and put them out to the field at a later date. Regarding right now, Megan, an interesting one building on what you just asked about is, there's a question, could there be formal partnerships established where institutions of higher education and out of school time providers could be directly involved in addressing learning loss, that some of the acceleration that students may need to engage in could take place in those settings? And if the commissioners have any thoughts about that?
I can jump in a bit on that. I think a lot of those partnerships have already been created largely on a regional basis. I mean, we talked about early college programs, but they require multiple institutions. They require a school district. They require a community college, and generally a four-year institution as well. I think partnerships and collaborations, which the other two commissioners have mentioned, are key. We are looking at significant collaborations across the higher education sector. What we are trying to avoid is a competition for fewer and fewer students. We believe that this will not serve anyone well, that collaboration and re-engaging those pipelines. I mean, community colleges lost a lot of students due to COVID, not only in Massachusetts, but nationally as well. And that impacts our four-year institutions because the pipelines that they had have been drying up. So we have to reestablish those linkages and those relationships. We are, in some respects, all dependent on everybody else, just as higher education is dependent on K through 12 and early childhood. Our institutions across our segments depend on each other for survival.
And I'll just jump in. I think I agree with everything that was said. And I think for EEC that oversees the out of school time licensing for anyone not a school district, I think that we've already seen that happening in many ways. And I think we see it to Commissioner Santiago's point around the local level collaboration with higher ed institutions of how they can meet the specific needs in rural versus urban communities and thinking through that. But I also think that we've seen this past year, as everyone has had to employ different strategies for addressing children's needs, we've seen these cross collaboration to try to leverage curriculum, to try to ensure that everyone was working together on parents, that we knew where children were every day as schools were employing remote learning strategies and childcare was picking up full day services for kids in need. And there were, I think we've already seen some of that. I think there's huge opportunities to continue the momentum. And I think as Commissioner Santiago highlighted, that our work and our job is to figure out where we pull some of those and accelerate them as we head into the recovery.
Do we have time, Chad, for a couple more questions or one more?
Sure. As time, this may allow us to end on a bit of an uplifting note. One of the questions asked about the federal role in education, and if the commissioners anticipate opportunities to partner with the federal level, particularly with the incoming Biden administration.
So at DESE, we've already had a chance to speak with Biden's transition team. They are clear that they want to get kids back in school, and they are clear that they're working on getting even more funding to the states to do so. And as you know, the federal government has already sent out initial funding last year through ESSER 1 and other dollars. We just got in ESSER 2, and there may be even more funding coming. And so that allows us as a state to think about how we can come together with all our community-based organizations, our families, the schools, to work together to really accelerate forward what's going to happen over the next few years. I think there's going to be a real unique opportunity with the dollars that are going to be invested in education to work together on behalf of our kids.
Anyone else?
I would just say that we are watching very carefully in a number of areas. The sexual assault bill that the legislature and the governor supported is important. We're looking to Washington, D.C. to make sure that we're aligned with what may be coming out of the federal government as well. The funding that the federal government provided under the stimulus bills to the states for distribution to the higher education institutions were hugely important in keeping those institutions afloat during these difficult financial times. I remind folks that when our state universities had to close their residence halls last spring, they were left with a bill of about $50 million, and we managed to refinance the loans and help them out. But our institutions have had a tough time financially with the reality that they faced, and that impacts students directly.
And I will just add, I think, you know, like my colleagues been in conversations with the Biden administration's transition team and thinking through the needs of the sector that we oversee specifically. And I think that like my colleague said, that the federal funding has been vital for our ability to be able to address and meet and pivot and do all the things we need to do to bring communities together to serve the children and families that they are. I will say that one really key highlight from the federal funding for childcare and specifically that is addressing a huge need across the country is the flexibility in the way that they've allowed us to spend it. Traditionally, childcare funding it's a private market serving a very public infrastructure good, and we have a challenge in that the only funding that the federal government has really targeted previously was a per child subsidy, which allowed us to alleviate tuition for some working families, but certainly didn't address the educational needs at the robust level that you see in other sectors of education. And so the flexibility provided by the federal dollars in the first two stimulus packages are things we continue to talk about with the Biden administration, and the proposals they put forth have maintained that, which will be vital for the recovery of this sector specifically, to position us to be partners with the other areas of education.
Commissioner Agnew-Tree-Vergy, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much, Commissioners Riley and Santiago. This has been an enormously enlightening and helpful conversation. And certainly there are challenges, so many challenges ahead, but thank you for the work that you do. And I will turn this over now to Chad.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you, Megan, for your moderation and how much we appreciate your seamless work at bringing in questions from the audience. It was great to have that part of the responses from the commissioners. Thank you very much. Thank you to the commissioners as well. Having these frank, honest conversations are part of the productive process of solving problems. And we, again, appreciate them giving of their time and their expertise to help us think about ways forward. I want to thank all of the speakers today who've been previously introduced and mentioned. We greatly appreciate them being part of this work. But on my end, a special shout out to the Rennie Center team, Sinead Chalmers, Sophie Zamaripa, Nena Bala, and Laura DeJourney. To be clear, while you did not see them today, the work that you are observing is the product of their smarts, their expertise, their strong efforts, and we really appreciate everything they do internally at the center. All of the work that we're doing at Rennie as part of Condition of Education, we are promoting a COE week this year, given that we couldn't do our in-person event. That includes the data dashboard. That includes the full recorded session with community programs. It includes links to resources and references of past research Rennie has done that directly relates to the issues of holistic learning, shared leadership, and multiple pathways to careers that we talked about today. It includes things like an interactive map illustrating all of the programs that we've highlighted over the 8 years that COE has been in existence. Please check those out at renniecenter.org. Thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of the afternoon. Take care.